My name is Nora Calloway. I am 26 years old, and the day my father's will was read aloud in a lawyer's office, every person in that room laughed, every person except me. Before I tell you what was on the last page, hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I always love knowing where you're listening from. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because this story didn't start at a lawyer's office. It started at a kitchen table in a house that smelled like motor oil and coffee, and something my father always called good enough. My father's name was Roy Calloway. He was a mechanic for 31 years. Same shop, same town, same blue coveralls with his name stitched above the pocket in gold thread. He wasn't a tall man. He wasn't a loud man. He drove a 1987 pickup truck that he had repaired so many times, it was more his work than the factory's. He said a thing once that I never forgot. If it still runs, it still matters. He said that about a lot of things. Cars, friendships, promises. My mother left when I was 7. She didn't disappear entirely. She called on birthdays for a few years. Then the calls got shorter. Then they stopped. My father never said anything harsh about her, not once. He just got up every morning and made breakfast and drove me to school and picked me up and drove me to school again. For years, it was just the two of us in that house. Me and Roy Calloway and the smell of motor oil and the 1987 truck parked in the driveway. He wasn't perfect. He didn't always know what to say. Sometimes he said nothing at all and just handed me something. A glass of water, a plate of toast, a folded 20 from his wallet. Like the object itself was the sentence he couldn't finish. But he showed up. Every time, without being asked. When I was 11, my father's older brother came back into our lives. His name was Franklin. Franklin Calloway had left our town at 22 and made money in commercial construction. Real money. The kind that changes how people look at you when you walk into a room. He drove a new car every 2 years and wore a watch that cost more than my father made in 3 months. And he had an opinion about everything, including things he knew nothing about. Franklin had a wife named Donna and 2 sons, my cousins Marcus and Drew. Marcus was a year older than me. Drew was 3 years younger. They were not unkind boys exactly, but they had grown up watching their father perform the specific confidence that comes from having always had enough, and some of it had transferred. Franklin began visiting every Thanksgiving. He sat at the head of the table in someone else's house and talked about developments and markets and projections. My father sat at the other end and passed the rolls and asked Drew about school. I watched all of it very carefully. One Thanksgiving when I was 14, Franklin was telling a long story about a deal he had closed in the Pacific Northwest. He had been talking for 20 minutes. He paused to refill his glass and looked across the table at my father and said, "Roy, when are you going to do something with your life?" As a joke. He said it as a joke. The table laughed. Donna touched her napkin to her mouth. Marcus looked at his phone. Drew laughed the longest. My father smiled. He reached for the gravy and passed it to Franklin without being asked. That was my father. He absorbed things, and then he did something useful. I excused myself from the table and went to the bathroom and stayed there for 4 minutes. I counted. Then I came back and ate my pie. After Thanksgiving, Franklin started calling more often. Always with advice. "Roy, you should invest. Roy, you should expand the shop. Roy, you should get a partner, a business partner, someone with vision." The word vision came up a lot when Franklin talked. Like vision was the thing my father was missing. Like 31 years of keeping every promise he ever made was something less than vision. My father listened. He said, "I'll think about it," which was what he said when he had already decided but didn't want to argue. He never expanded the shop. He never got a business partner. He kept his blue coveralls and his gold thread name and his 1987 truck. I left for college when I was 18. I studied accounting, not because I loved it immediately, but because I understood it. Numbers were honest. They didn't perform. They didn't tell you what you wanted to hear. They just were what they were, and you either understood them or you didn't. I came home every summer. My father and I would sit on the back porch in the evenings, and he would tell me about cars he had fixed that week, and I would tell him about things I was learning, and neither of us talked about the future because neither of us needed to. Those evenings were some of the best hours of my life. Franklin visited less once I was in college. He had discovered golf and a group of men who also played golf, and they occupied most of his leisure time. But he called my father occasionally, and the advice continued.
Roy, at your age.
Roy, you need to think about retirement.
Roy, the shop isn't going to run itself.
That last one was particularly interesting given that my father ran the shop entirely by himself and had for 3 decades. My father got sick in the spring of the year I turned 24. It started slowly, the way those things sometimes do, with tiredness and a cough that didn't leave, and a color in his face that wasn't quite right. By June it had a name. By August it had a timeline. I moved home in September. I am not going to tell you a great deal about those 8 months, except to say this. My father spent them the same way he had spent the 31 years before. Them. Quietly, purposefully, with his attention on whatever and whoever was in front of him rather than on himself. He fixed 3 cars in October. He said he wanted to finish what he had started. He talked to me every evening. Sometimes about nothing. Sometimes about the truck. Sometimes about my mother, without bitterness, just facts, just the shape of a story he wanted me to have. He said, "You turned out well, Nora. Not because of me. You just did. But I want you to know I noticed. I told him it was because of him." He shook his head. "You were always going to be this. I was just here." In the last weeks, Franklin called more often. He visited twice. He sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and talked about what needed to be sorted out. Practicalities, he called them. The shop, the house, the truck. He said these things in a gentle tone. Gentle the way a bulldozer is gentle when it is moving slowly. My father listened and said he had things handled. Franklin raised his eyebrows. "Roy, you have a shop and a house and some savings. That's not nothing. You need a plan." "I have a plan," my father said. Franklin looked at me across the kitchen. I looked back at him and said nothing. My father died on a Thursday morning in April. It was raining. The pear tree in the backyard had just started to bloom. I was in the room. I was holding his hand. He had asked me to read aloud to him, and I had been reading for 2 hours, and somewhere in the middle of a chapter he simply went quiet and didn't come back. I sat with him for a while after. Then I called the people who needed to be called. Franklin arrived that same evening with Donna and Marcus and Drew. They filled the small kitchen and talked about arrangements with the efficiency of people who had been through this before or believed they had. Franklin kept saying we need to make sure everything is in order. He said it 5 times in an hour. "Everything is in order," I told him. He patted my hand. "Of course it is," he said, which was not the same thing as believing me. The will reading was scheduled for 10 days after the funeral. Franklin moved the date up by 3 days. I'm not sure how he managed that, but he managed it. He arrived at the lawyer's office with Donna and both boys in a car I hadn't seen before. Another new one. The lawyer's name was Edwin Park. He was a small, neat man with wire-rimmed glasses and a very organized desk and the particular stillness of someone who has sat in rooms like this many times and knows exactly what is going to happen next even when no one else does. There were 8 of us in the room. Me, Franklin, Donna, Marcus, Drew. My father's old friend Terrence, who had worked at the shop for 6 years before his back gave out. My mother's sister, Aunt Claudia, who had stayed close to my father even after my mother left, because she said Roy Calloway was the best person she had personally ever met. And Edwin Park. Edwin Park opened a folder. He explained that Roy Calloway had prepared his will and related documents over a period of several years, most recently updated 14 months ago. He said the estate included the house, the auto shop and its equipment, the 1987 pickup truck, and savings and investments totaling. He paused here. $412,000. Franklin sat up straighter in his chair. Marcus and Drew exchanged a look. Donna smoothed her skirt. Edwin Park continued reading. The house was to be given to me. The auto shop and all equipment to Terrence, in full, free and clear. The 1987 truck to Aunt Claudia, because Roy had written, she was the only other person he knew who understood that something still running still matters. There were small bequests for a few others. A donation to the library in town where my father had held a library card for 40 years. A donation to the automotive vocational program at the county high school. Then Edwin Park reached the savings and investments. $412,000. Franklin leaned forward. Edwin read, "The savings and investments in the amount of $412,000 are to be held in trust." He paused. "For the Cedar Ridge Automotive Scholarship Fund, to be administered by Nora Calloway, for the purpose of funding vocational training and apprenticeships for young people in the county who cannot afford it, in perpetuity." The room was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then Franklin laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had heard something he found genuinely absurd. He said Roy left everything to a scholarship fund. He said it out loud, to no one in particular, like he needed to hear the words in his own voice to believe them. Marcus shook his head slowly. Drew said, "He gave the money away." Donna looked at her hands. Franklin composed himself and leaned toward Edwin Park. "Is there more?" He said it plainly. "Is this the whole document?" Edwin Park looked at Franklin over his wire-rimmed glasses. "There is one more page," he said. Franklin settled back. "Right. There it is." Marcus sat up. Drew stopped shaking his head. Edwin Park turned to the last page of the document. He was quiet for a moment. Then he read, "To my brother Franklin," Roy had written. "I want to start by saying that I know you meant well. I believe that. You always thought I needed more than I had. You thought bigger was better and more was more, and that a man was measured by what he accumulated. I never agreed with you, but I never said so, because you are my brother. And I loved you, and arguing with people you love about the things they believe most deeply is a way of losing them without meaning to." Edwin continued, reading, "But I want to say something now because I won't have another chance to say it. I had a good life. I had exactly the life I wanted. I had a shop that ran. I had a truck that ran. I had a daughter who is the most honest and capable person I have ever known. I had 31 years of work that mattered to the people who brought me their cars, because a car is how a person gets to their job, and their children, and their doctor, and their life. I fixed things that mattered to people who needed them. I never once wished I had done something different." Franklin was very still. Edwin kept reading. "The scholarship fund was not an accident. I have been saving for it since Nora was 12 years old. I watched a boy in this town turn down a chance at a good trade because his family couldn't pay for the training, and I thought, that is something I can fix. So I fixed it. Quietly. The way I fix everything. I did not need anyone to know while I was alive. I only need Nora to know now, so she can run it the right way." Aunt Claudia pressed her hand over her mouth. Terrence looked at the ceiling. Edwin's voice stayed steady. "To Marcus and Drew," Roy had written. "I hope you find something you love as much as I love the shop. I hope you find something that makes you want to get up in the morning not because of what it pays, but because of what it is. I hope no one ever makes you feel small for loving it." And then the last paragraph. "To Nora, you sat with me every evening for 8 months. You read to me. You made sure the pear tree got watered. You never once asked what you were getting, and never once let me see you grieve until I couldn't see anything anymore. You are not getting the money because I think you need it. You are administering the fund because I know you will do it right. The house is yours because you should have a place that belongs to you. I want you to know that I was never just here. I was exactly where I wanted to be. Take care of the truck if Claudia will let you borrow it sometimes. It still runs. It still matters." Edwin Park closed the folder. The room was completely silent. Franklin sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him. His face had changed. Not broken, not angry. Just changed. The way a face changes when it has absorbed something it did not expect and does not quite know yet what to do with. Marcus was looking at the table. Drew was looking at the window. Donna was looking at her husband. Aunt Claudia was crying quietly. The way people cry when they are not trying to cry. But the thing is simply too true to sit inside without spilling. Terrence had his hands over his face. I sat still. I had read the will before. My father had read it to me himself in the kitchen, 8 months ago, when he told me he had things handled. He had read me every word, and then folded it, and handed it to Edwin Park, and poured us both coffee, and asked me what I thought about the pear tree. I had told him I thought it needed water. He had said, "So give it water." I had said, "Dad." He had said, Nora, give the tree some water. Everything else is handled. After the reading, Edwin Park asked if anyone had questions. No one did. Franklin asked to use the restroom. Marcus went outside. Drew stood by the window for a long time. In the parking lot, Franklin found me before I reached my car. He stood in front of me with his hands in his jacket pockets. It was a cool day. There were clouds moving fast across the sky. He said, "I didn't know about the fund." I said, "No one did except Edwin Park." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long?" 14 years, I said, "since I was 12. Franklin nodded slowly. He looked like he was going to say something else. He started to, and then didn't. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder, and then walked back to his car. I don't know what he was going to say. I think maybe he didn't know either. I drove home in my father's truck. Aunt Claudia had told me to take it for the day. She would pick it up on the weekend. I drove slowly through town. I went past the shop, which had a closed sign on the door and a card from Terrence in the window that said "back soon." I went past the library. I went past the county high school where the automotive vocational program had a banner over the entrance that said something about registration, opening in the fall. I parked in the driveway of the house that now belonged to me. The pear tree in the backyard had fully bloomed since the day my father died. It was white and heavy and very still in the afternoon light. I sat on the back porch for a long time. In the weeks that followed, I set up the Cedar Ridge Automotive Scholarship Fund properly. I worked with Edwin Park on the structure and the application process. I contacted the vocational program at the high school and 2 others in adjacent counties. I put together a simple website with a clear application form and a brief paragraph explaining what the fund was and who it was for. On the website, I wrote a short line about my father. Roy Calloway was a mechanic for 31 years. He believed that if something still runs, it still matters. He started this fund because he watched a young person lose an opportunity that a little money could have opened. He saved quietly for 14 years, so that would not happen again. Within 3 weeks, we had received 41 applications. The first scholarship was awarded to a 17-year-old named Isaac, the son of a single mother who worked at a grocery store 2 towns over. He wanted to be an automotive technician. He had rebuilt an engine in his backyard from parts he bought with money he earned mowing lawns. He just needed someone to pay for the formal training. I called him to tell him he had received the scholarship. He was quiet for a moment after I told him. Then he said, "Are you serious?" I said, "Yes. Your training starts in September." He said, "My mom is going to cry." I said, "That's okay." He said, "Thank you." "Who should I thank?" "Who started this?" I said, "A mechanic named Roy Calloway. He had a shop in this town for 31 years. Isaac said, "I'll remember that." I believed him. Marcus called me about 2 months after the will reading. I didn't expect that. We had never been particularly close. He was polite on the phone and a little careful, like someone feeling for steady ground. He asked how the fund was going. I told him about Isaac. He listened. Then he said, "My dad hasn't talked about a lot since the reading, not in his usual way." I said, "I think that's okay." Marcus said, "He told me once that Uncle Roy was the most stubborn man he ever met." I said, "He was. He never changed his mind about anything that mattered." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think my dad meant it as a criticism. But I'm not sure anymore." I told him I thought his father had loved my father in the way that people sometimes love the version of someone they wish existed instead of the version that actually did. That it wasn't malicious. It was just a kind of blindness. You can love someone and still not see them. Marcus said, "Yeah." Then he said he might want to volunteer with the fund someday, when he had more time. I told him the offer was open. I don't know if he will. But I think he meant it when he said it. Franklin sent a letter in June, a handwritten letter which surprised me. It was on plain white paper in his small, neat handwriting. He is a careful writer. Each sentence was complete and specific. He wrote that he had been thinking about what my father had done and why he had done it. He wrote that he had never understood Roy, not really, and that he was beginning to think this was his failure, rather than my father's. He wrote that he had spent his life believing that success looked a particular way, and that this belief had made him unable to see other kinds of success, even when they were right in front of him at his own Thanksgiving table. He wrote one more thing. He said that, when Edwin Park read the last page of the will, he had felt ashamed, not of my father, of himself. He said he had never felt ashamed in quite that way before, and that it was unpleasant. And also, he thought, probably correct. He said he hoped I would write back if I felt like it, and that he understood if I didn't. I wrote back. Not a long letter, but a real one. I told him my father had spoken of him with affection even at the end. That Roy Calloway had loved his brother even while disagreeing with everything Franklin Calloway believed about how a life should be measured. That the will was not meant to shame anyone. It was just meant to be true. Franklin wrote back 2 weeks later. He said, "That sounds like Roy." I thought, yes, it does. The pear tree in the backyard bloomed again this spring. I have watered it every week. I sit on the back porch in the evenings sometimes, the same way my father and I used to, and I look at it. The shop reopened under Terrence, who put a new sign above the door. The name he chose was Calloway and Sons, which confused people who knew Terrence had no sons. He told me he chose it because the shop was Roy's, and because Roy would have liked the idea that there were sons here, young people learning something real, even if the name wasn't literal. He hired 2 apprentices in the fall. He sends me updates occasionally, short messages, a photo of someone's first completed brake job, or a note saying the alignment lift is running better than it has in years. Isaac completed his first semester of training. He sent me a message that said only, "The teacher said I have good instincts. I thought you should know. I thought my father should know. I drive the truck sometimes when Aunt Claudia doesn't need it. It is 38 years old. It makes a sound on cold mornings that I can only describe as reluctant, like it is deciding whether today is worth the effort. But it starts, every time, without fail. If it still runs, it still matters." I think about my father most mornings, not with grief exactly, though the grief is there. I think about him the way you think about someone who taught you something so fundamental that it becomes invisible. You stop noticing you learned it because it has simply become the way you see. Taught me that the size of a life is not the same as the weight of it. He taught me that you can do something for 14 years without telling anyone, and it is still real. More real, maybe, for the silence. He taught me that a thing still running still matters. Cars, promises, pear trees in backyards. Scholarship funds run by daughters who learned everything they know from a man in blue coveralls with his name in gold thread. I am telling you this story, not because I want you to be angry at Franklin. Franklin is not a villain. He is a man who believed what most people believe, that more is better, that bigger means successful, that a quiet life is a smaller life. Most of us believe some version of this. Most of us have sat at a table and made someone feel that what they had was less than it should be. I am telling you this because of the last page, because my father had one chance to say the things he hadn't said and he used it not to correct anyone or settle any score, but to tell the truth, plainly, completely, with love for the people who had understood him and without bitterness for the people who hadn't. That is the hardest thing. I think that is the hardest thing a person can do, to have been underestimated for years, and to use your final words not as a weapon, but as a window. If you have someone in your life who is quiet, who shows up without being asked, who fixes things and passes the gravy and turns the heat up and asks if you're warm, I want you to look at them tonight. Not because they need you to say anything, just because they deserve to be seen. My father spent a long time being seen mostly by me. I was enough for him. He told me that. But I think he deserves to be seen by a few more people now. That is why I am telling you this story. If it meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you are new here, I would love for you to subscribe. There are more stories coming. I will see you in the next one.